the Center for Technology.
I think he clicked on leave meeting instead of got it.
Okay.
Yeah, might have done it mistakenly.
Okay. So,
Tina, do you have the document with you? Go ahead if you have.
Yes, sir. Let me just get it.
Should I?
I have it.
Okay, all right. Ma'am has it.
So I'll introduce Alex. Alex Lee is a professor at the Department of British and American Cultural Studies and a founding director of the Center for Technology and Humanities, King Hee University, South Korea. He was invited as a visiting professor at the Center for Cultural Media and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia University, India, and an international visiting scholar at Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, National Taiwan University. He's a member of the advisory board for the International Delusion Group Studies in Asia and the board member of the International Consortium of the Critical Theory and ATN, that is Asia Theories Network. He edited the third volume of The Idea of Communism and published articles in various journals such as Telos, Delusion Group Studies in Philosophy Today, and chapters in the Bloomsbury Handbook of World Theory, Thinking with Animation, Back to 30s, Recurring Crisis of Capitalism, Liberalism, and Democracy, and Balibar Wallerstein's Race, Nation, Class, Rereading a Dialogue for Our Times, published in 2018. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you for warm kind introduction. So about actually this technological problem, I moved to Ljubljana in Slovenia last night, and then I didn't check up the Wi-Fi.
No, Alex. No, Alex. It's not working. Isn't it, Manoj?
No.
It's not working. So. It's not working. You're hardly audible. So no worries, no worries. Should I continue, Manoj, then?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So Alex is having problem with his bandwidth because he's traveling. So very sorry about it. So we have this non-plenary session on post-human hybridities. This is a non-plenary session 5th on the day 2nd, right? And we have 4 scholars reading their papers, Zainab, Swati, Mohit, and Arnab Chakarbati, right? So we start with our first, all the participants, we have 20 minutes each allotted for presentation. And we will be collating the questions for the discussion after your presentations, right? So I can see Zainab. Just give me a minute to introduce her. Yeah. Zeynep is currently working as a book editor and translator in a Turkish publishing house. Specializing in English, German, and French, she translated and edited over 100 books for several companies. She currently resides and works in Istanbul, Turkey, after living several years in Germany and France for her studies. After completing her studies in the cinema and television department at Istanbul Bilgi University, she took her graduate degree in film theory from some university in France. Although not currently connected to academia, she continues to expand her academic knowledge and curiosity in 21st century philosophy, queer and gender theory, and psychology. The areas she's interested the most in are the works of Deleuze and Guattari, Butler, Haraway, Preciado, and Wittig. Over to you, Zainab. 20 minutes for your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I first want to thank everyone who is taking a part in organizing this event in these COVID times, because it gives us an amazing chance to connect with each other. And give me a minute, sorry. Today, I want to talk about or cyber personas in general and cybersex in particular. And I'll try to demonstrate how cyberspace can become a plane of emergence for a body without organs. I also want to discuss the gender and sexuality of our cyber selves and how we can use cybersex as a way to transform ourselves into becoming genderless. In a Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway argued that we were all already cyborgs, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. I aim to explore the planes of cybersex that blur the boundaries of the virtual and the real, or the virtual and the physical, with the help of the latest interactive sex toys. With the introduction of computers and then the internet in the 90s, sexual interactions and remote sex work gained a new medium. When we think about the beginning of cybersex, the interaction between the sex worker and the client remained mainly verbal and was conducted either via phone or via internet chat. During this stage, cybersex stayed in the domain of fantasy, and desire was stimulated through written or verbal communications. With the invention of webcams in 1993, cybersex gained an audiovisual and temporal element as sexual performers began to livecast videos of themselves. This change in remote sexual work created another level of fantasy into sex work, one of exhibitionism and voyeurism. Although porn satisfied voyeuristic, exhibitionistic desire, there were no connections between the sexual performer and the voyeur. But with the live cat videos and video chatting, both simultaneity and interaction were added to the mix. Although this definitely added new planes of existence to an otherwise one-dimensional sexual practice, the webcam videos still remain in the realm of fantasy because they can only manifest themselves into the physical world with self-stimulation. Today, there are thousands of websites dedicated to online and real-time cybersex. And with the latest high-tech wearable vibrators, the user can receive real-time vibrations sent by other people with a connection via Bluetooth and the internet. For the first time, cybersex exits the virtual space and enters into the physical space. It also changes the one-dimensional and hierarchical structure of cybersex, in which there was a hierarchical distinction between the performer and the viewer. The sexual interaction in old practices was designed so that the sex worker sells a performance for the viewer to use it to achieve sexual pleasure. Even though the performer can also get sexual satisfaction, either because of the exhibitionistic quality of these videos or because of their own fantasies, these video castings stayed one-sided, and the performer was the one who gives the performance, and the viewer was the one who receives sexual stimulation and satisfaction. In the paper that I'm planning to write, I aim to map the current cybersex practices that blend the lines between the virtual and the physical. I also want to explore the concepts of exhibitionism and voyeurism, virtual and physical, and the body without organs in connection to cybersex. In the second part of this presentation, I will focus on how desire is created in cybersex by forming assemblages between bodies without organs. I will take the standpoint that everyone who engages in cybersex is in fact a hybrid of machine and organism. In the last part, I will attempt to define the gender and sexuality of this semi-machinic desire. Can we call ourselves heterosexual or homosexual when we take part in cybersex? What desire do we feel, and what kind of satisfaction we create by connecting or machinic selves to other machines? And finally, does the cyborg has a gender, and can we still stay woman or man in a system in which we interact sexually with machines? In the beginning, cybersex stayed in the domain of the fantasy and self-stimulation, whether it is done through phone, texting, or videos. In this phase, it corresponded more or less to masturbation, the communication with another person taking the place of the fantasy as the stimulator. Until recent years, on the websites in which people create sexual content and interact with their viewers, a clear hierarchy existed between the performer and the viewer. In this setting, the performer controls what the viewer can see, and in the case of live videos, the viewer couldn't alter the performance or touch the performer, so to speak. This stayed really close to the dynamic of exhibitionism and voyeurism, in which the viewer stays passive and the exhibitionist controls how the performance will go and when it will end. Campsites next entered the scene, which changed this hierarchical structure. In these sites, performers create a room and live feed their performances to multiple people at the same time. The duality of performer-viewer, or of the performer and the viewer, changed into a group activity. All the anonymous viewers forming a sort of assemblage of a single hierarchical entity. In these rooms, viewers can tip the performer to do special things, which allows the viewers to gain a more active role and gives them the ability to alter the performance. In 2010, a new line of vibrators called teledildonics or cyberdildonics started to emerge, which can be connected to smartphones and computers via Bluetooth and can be controlled remotely through an app. Aimed at first for couples in long-distance relationships, these new sex toys quickly gained popularity with webcam performers. This new shift in cybersex changed its plane of existence from the domain of fantasy to physicality. I like to take a moment to explain how these devices work. They have different shapes designed for different body types, like the classic vibrators, variable smaller vibrators, and anal plugs. The user wears the device and connects it to an app via Bluetooth. Every device has a special link that can be accessed with this app, and people who ask the link can directly manipulate the device and by proxy the user. Campsites have integrated programs that use the setting, and the viewers in the room can send a vibration to the device when they pay a certain amount of money. Aditi, if you can open the presentation now, I want to show some examples. Yes, thank you. This is the VVibe sync model, for example, that was created both for men and women. And you can see there is a remote, but you can also control it from the app. And can we go to the second one, please? This is designed for men, obviously, is a penis ring, and the WeConnect app, which is the most popular app. And the third one, please. Yes, this is a smaller model that is barely visible from the outside. It's Lovence's Lush Tree. Do we have another one, or is this all? Yes, and that's the male masturbator. I don't know how many people use this because it's a weird thing. To tell you the truth, it's like an empty vessel, but VVibe also have a male masturbator, mainly aimed at couples again, that sends vibrations. And now, yeah, that's all with the presentation. Thank you. I mean the PowerPoint presentation, of course. Yes, thank you. The plane of existence cybersexual machines enter while engaging in cybersex is not purely virtual anymore, as they connect to other people and receive these vibrations which directly affect their physical body. Cybersex, when done with cyberdildonics, exits the domain of fantasy and becomes physical by electrical stimulations transmitted to sexual organs. The performer using these high-tech sex toys becomes a cyborg-human hybrid as they connect themselves to a machine to receive what is aimed to imitate the human touch. I also believe that cybersex with cyberdildonics can be an opportunity to become a body without organs, because like the dog on egg, the body in cybersex is disconnected from its unity and its own organism, performing only with its sexual organs, connecting to other bodies without organs through a machine and a complex set of networks. Like the unproductive, the sterile, the unengendered, the uninconsumable body without the organs, the cybersex body is unproductive. It's only producing desire and pleasure by connecting to other machines and can be neither fertile nor consumable. Looking at this point of view, connecting yourself to a sex machine that is itself connected to internet and then connecting inorganically to other sex machines in order to create desire can be the perfect example of desiring machines. Now, of course, I don't want to mean that everyone who engage in cybersex is after becoming a body without organs, but people don't solely engage in cybersex because it's more convenient or practical. There is always a level of escaping from reality that plays a part in cybersex fantasy. We can imagine two forms of cybersex at this point, a molar and molecular cybersex. The molecular cybersex gives people the ability to transform themselves into a becoming, which in this case can also be a becoming genderless or a genderless becoming, however you want to phrase it. When we think of the sexuality and gender of the cyborg, the image that was planted to our collective unconscious is always the hypersexualized female cyborg, ready to satisfy humans' every desire and need. The movies, video games, science fiction books paint a picture of complete submission at first, as cyborgs as sex machines or modern slaves. For the first time in history, humans are the creators and have complete control over their creation. This hierarchy between cyborgs and humans at this point is very clear, favoring human beings as the superior race. Then this image quickly changes to war machines, cyborgs using humans' weakness for sex in order to obtain world domination. Humans versus cyborgs, flesh versus cybernetics, real versus fabricated. That's the opposition we get from the cyborg genre. But what gender does the cyborg have? And what is its sexuality? What becomes of desire when it's converted to zeros and ones? Although the cyborg genre draws a very concrete boundary between humans and cyborgs, we have to also keep in mind that we are already cyborgs in the eyes of the system. We are work machines, revenue machines, reproduction machines, consuming machines. Furthermore, we are already physically becoming cyborg hybrids with iPods in our ears, nanorobots used for surgeries running through our veins, or smartphones becoming as an extension to our hands. Or cyber personas are taking the place of our physical selves, and cyberspace is quickly becoming the primary space to find connection and satisfaction. In a Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway pairs cyborgs with minorities, especially with women of color, because of their hierarchical position in the patriarchal world. But this does not define the cyborg's gender, even the gender of female cyborgs, and it's rather an indicator of their political position. Haraway speculates that, I'm quoting, the cyborg can create a world without gender and maybe without genesis, nor does it mark time on an Oedipal calendar, attempting to heal the terrible charges of gender in an oral symbiotic utopia or post-Oedipal apocalypse. The cyborg is the ultimate desiring machine, unable to participate in reproduction and using desire to form connections to other machines. Like Haraway also said, in almost all these stories, cyborgs seek to create a unity or a cyborg organism, and this is what enables them to create the apocalypse. By gendering cyborgs as female, men try to keep cyborgs as another minority. The cyborg's only chance at creating the human apocalypse is by uniting with other machines. It's curious to consider how cyborgs' desire for unity resonates with the desire machines' goal at destroying the system's structure of exploitation, servitude, and hierarchy. Cyborgs, in the sense, are literally bodies without organs, connecting mechanically to other machines and forming new connections. A body without organs is an empty body, devoid of its organs, and that void is indispensable because it's the only way for the body to be solely occupied by intensities. In a body without organs, in which no organism, no hierarchy, and no construction remains, these intensities form new and ever-changing connections that differentiate itself from the organic body with its ability of constant change and the fact that it can avoid creating a hierarchy between organs. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari offer masochism as a medium to become a body without organs. According to them, the masochistic body isn't after pain or even after fantasy. Its aim is to become a body without organs by sealing every point of connection in their body. In the lack of organic tools for connection, like the mouth for talking, ears for listening, and sexual parts for intercourse, the body without organs creates desire through a new set of organs, which is through pain in the case of the masochistic body. But cybersex can be a safer, temporary experimentation of a body without organs. Its virtuality and temporality allows the organic body to return to their reality after the experimentation is over. And this is the primary necessity to reach a body without organs, according to Deleuze and Guattari. I'm quoting them now, to leave some of the strata behind to turn back to, in order not to become an empty, suicidal, schizoid body. As Deleuze and Guattari said, you have to keep enough of the organism for it to reform each dawn, and you have to keep small supplies of significance and subjectification. Cybersex's possibility at becoming a tool to create a body without organs stays hidden at first unless one starts to contemplate on its entire process. Through connecting a part of our bodies to a machinic device, we are able to connect to other people via machines and the internet. The rest of the physical body is simply diminished to an image on the audiovisual plane, while sexual organs connected to teledildonics enter into an interactive physical virtual plane. This process destroys the organism of the body as a whole and enables the participant to experience the state of being a body without organs. Their desire and libidos are digitalized, and this digital data creates physical reactions. The use of technological sex toys like vibrators already moved humans into the field of the cyborg, but by giving the user the ability to connect to other users, cyberdildonics also created a social experience. We also have to keep in mind that cyberdildonics are in their very early stages, and in January 2021, one of the lead producers, Lovens, announced that their toys give its user the ability to participate in digital orgies with up to 100 people via WhatsApp. When we imagine 100 random people connecting digitally and receiving sexual satisfaction through an app, we are facing a true assemblage which can revolutionize the way sex works in the future. If we have to think about the sexuality of this group of people, we cannot still call them heterosexuals, homosexuals, bisexuals, and so on, both because of the fact that it's impossible for them to really know the gender of the other 99 people, but also because they became a unity, an assemblage of desire, receiving one big orgasm at the end of this digital orgy. An assemblage cannot have a gender, as it's changing and transforming itself continuously, nor its desire can be translated into a category, making it impossible to discuss its sexual preferences. As Guattari stated in an interview with George Stambolian titled A Liberation of Desire, machines arrange and connect flows. They do not recognize distinctions between persons, organs, material flows, and semiotic flows. Nor will the cyborg or cyborg-human hybrids distinguish what is people and what is machine, what is organic and what is inorganic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Zainab. On mark, you were within the time limits. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Because we have, back-to-back sessions. So thank you. It was a wonderful presentation on cybersex, exhibitionism, and voyeurism. So we'll discuss later on after all the speakers they present, right? Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Do we have Swati, next presenter? Yes, Swati is here. So I'll just introduce you, and then you can begin your presentation, which is on neoliberalism, the viral vector, and the larval populations. Swati Sinha is a PhD research scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Kharagpur. She's also engaged as an assistant professor at an undergraduate college under Bankura University. Her research interests span culture and critical theory, with particular focus on Deleuze and Guattari's mobilization of desire as a concept and its critical agency in the reconstitution of the unconscious. Swati, please. So 20 minutes.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers and extend my greetings to everyone present today. The title of my paper is Neoliberalism, the Viral Vector and Larval Populations. The article in hindsight looks at the politics of asymmetrical mobility regimes and how it has been further amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. It seeks to explore how this virus has inflected our everyday and quotidian understandings of mobility and brought it into closer proximity with biomedical registers of interpretation. This interpenetration of pathogenic profiling and our everyday practices, care, and management of our bodies has led to a redefinition of social mobilities. The article takes as its premise the analogous mode of operation that the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism and the viral vector both share as liquid regimes. Yet the influx of the virus has introduced significant changes in the metabolism of the social organism, which exceed the manipulations of computational capital and thus require an insightful analysis. The discursive trajectory of the virus binds the biosocial, the biopolitical, and the biomedical in relations of mutual reciprocity, emphasizing our interconnected life processes. Against the backdrop of the viral interventions, the article examines immobilities in the regime of capital circulation and reproduction on the one hand, and extreme mobilities or hypermobilities of subaltern populations on the other. The first section of the essay seeks to understand the pathogenic properties of the virus as framed within medical literature, while the next section looks into the imbrication of the biomedical, the biopolitical, and the biosocial, focusing on the shared constitutional chemistry of the virus and neoliberal democracies, specifically in terms of molecular mobilities and pathogenic properties, while at the same time recognizing the possible emergence of more robust lines of flight and radical mobilities that the viral vector has catalyzed in the form of larval populations, engaging in public demonstrations and civic protests. The viral outbreak. Whether the virus has been artificially synthesized using sophisticated biomedical engineering in an artificial biotechnical space, belonging to an advanced technoscientific milieu, or whether it is a natural hazard of global proportions, a biochemical anomaly spawned by massive ecological imbalances, remains a debatable question, tied up with issues integral to the phrasing of the milieu as that of the Biocene or the Anthropocene. We can perhaps settle with the observation that the virus comprises of a complex amalgamation of strands that are both synthetic and organic, that can be synthesized within an artificial lab environment while demonstrating organic properties guided by an evolutionary impulse. This is exemplified in the rapid mutations that the virus has undergone, raising doubts about sustainable biomedical interventions in the management and control of the viral graph. The viral influx remains a molecular process whose sporadic strikes elude the surveillance mechanism of both the organism and the body politic, or the neoliberal infrastructure of the state. The lack of visibility or visible symptoms, as in the asymptomatic and the oscillating strike rate of the virus, reproduce the mechanics of a guerrilla warfare whose dynamics seem to elude all predictions based on mathematical modeling and statistical forecasts. Cluster infections erupt randomly, rapidly gain in momentum through community transmission and recede towards more vulnerable demographies once the infection rate reaches a saturation point. This resonates with the mechanism of neoliberal polities, where capital permeates the body politic, appropriates its metabolic processes, and upon reaching the point of saturation, diversifies its production by migrating to peripheral or marginal zones in search of prospective markets for fresh investments. In the light of the metabolic changes triggered by the virus, the article engages with the following questions to understand its multi-componential and imbricated ecology. What are the possible accords between neoliberalism and the pandemic? Which are the points of deviation as far as the respective metabolic speeds and molecular intensities are concerned? How does the virus reformulate the decentralized politics of neoliberalism? How has the virus as an invisible war machine enabled new mobilities in the sphere of the everyday? How do these new social mobilities, identified as larval populations, contribute to a transformative politics of the everyday? The epoch of the virusine may be perceived as a swirl of molecular forces and their ability to engender a critical revolution in thought, transforming the deliberative space of the everyday through the introduction of novel critical dispositives. The biomedical, the biopolitical, and the biosocial. The next section looks at the imbricated nature of pathogenic infiltration, everyday rituals of social kinesis, and neoliberal democracies. The biosocial ramifications of such an interpenetration are investigated through a process of closely monitoring the differences in the metabolic activity of the social organism with the introduction of the virus as a novel chemical intervention. Emergent neoliberal economies thrive on a politics of social metastability, but the majority of the population skirts the margins of precariousness in terms of not being assimilated into social security or welfare schemes. With the intervention of the C-19 pandemic, the operative algorithm behind the carefully crafted politics of metastability practiced by nascent neoliberal polities was upended by an exterior force, a war machine of sorts that in operation, analogous to the molecular dynamism of neoliberalism, rapidly saturated the entire system through a process of microbial infiltration. The infinitesimal distributory networks of the virus, which could not be scanned by the digital eye, enabled it to take on the proportions of a planetary crisis. Remaining elusive to the state's limited application of the biopolitical imaginary, constrained by the logistics of capitalism, the C-19 pandemic, through its spectral modalities of capture, threatened to derail our poultry defense mechanism, upend the algorithmically calibrated flux of capital, and expose the fault lines of the system, whose combing operations have proved unequal to the task of detecting the microscopic intracellular dimensions of the virus. There is thus a conceptual overlap between the virusine and the capitalocene in terms of molecular organization. As an organic anomaly that installed itself within the normative regime of capitalism, the virus anarchized the productive mechanics of the system and spawned its own counterproductive nefarious network that denatured and colonized the cellular mechanism of the organism, or in the case of the nomos, unsettled its capitalist configurations. The trend of social distancing, which followed the outbreak of the virus, was based on a complex mechanism of dispersal, where the potenza or vitalism embodied in the virus was scaled down to manageable proportions by splintering it into identifiable geospatial clusters, thus breaking down the viral load into manageable proportions to neutralize the threat of community transmission. The communitas or community space, which became a key vector of viral escalation when envisioned as a mass, had to be splintered into unitary demographic profiles. Civic functions had to be curtailed, and the symbiotic economic exchanges within the nomos had to be suspended to break the chain of infection, thus partially deactivating or immobilizing the economy and freezing large chunks of the service sector. The explosive outbreak of C-19 and the closure of the economy was followed by waves of internal migrations of displaced labor who suddenly found themselves out of work. With the outbreak of the pandemic and serial lockdowns, the migrant labor force suddenly found themselves trapped in an extraordinary state of what Ghassan Hay just termed stuckedness. Cordoned off and in dire straits, were expected to silently bear the brunt of adversity, slowly succumbing to hunger, making themselves scarce and volatile to ease the burden on the economy. The community of stray workers skirting the perimeters of the urban technopolis were never integrated into the economic infrastructure, but were selectively recruited on stringent labor policies as ground staff to prop up the systemic bulwark of neoliberal technocracies. At the hint of a first major setback, the economy was prompt enough to disgorge them from the system as pathogens, which when present in excess, may escalate levels of toxicity in an already fragile economy on the brink of a fiscal disaster. As a result, migrant workers marooned in cities were forced to resort to extreme mobilities. From a Foucauldian perspective, this could be interpreted as a mechanism of subtraction to shed off the excess load and reinforce buoyancy in the economy. Thus, entire populations, this is a quote from Foucault's Right of Death and Power of Life, entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter. In the name of life necessity, massacres have become vital. Foucault speaks of anatomopolitics of the human body, which deploys the body as a machine, maximizing performativity through extortion of labor, ensuring its utility within the economic state infrastructure. To keep a tab on the logistics of population management, a rigorous screening process is deployed involving, quote, an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of population. Systemic longevity thus has to be ensured at the expense of the precariatization of subpopulations placed at the systemic periphery with no or limited access to public health, housing, and social security. The celerity of the virus ascribes to it the properties of an invisible war machine that permeates the everyday and eludes detection by stratified systems of surveillance involving numerous checkpoints. As a corollary of the viral influx replicating its randomized microbial proliferation, the article looks at the phenomenon of larval subjects as another instantiation of molecular mobilities inundating the social plane to engineer a transformative politics at the grassroots level. On the surface, the line of flight traced by the virus has a close affinity with the practice of neoliberalism, as they both belong to fluid regimes of operation. This explains why the operative logic of the medico-scientific discourses rolled out to contain the viral graph through stringent social curbs and mobility restrictions also decelerated the economic stridency of neoliberalism and adversely affected its market dynamics. However, the virus seems to reiterate the decentralized politics of neoliberalism with the difference. Neoliberal economies subscribe to a partial line of flight that allows for a graded crossing of thresholds. The calibrated flux of neoliberal economies is hemmed in by invisible accords based on an axiomatics of profit. The article suggests that within the viral vector, this partial line of flight transforms into an absolute line of deterritorialization, thus exceeding all invisible boundaries in defiance of an axiomatics of control based on carefully modulated flux. These insurgent mobility graphs that seek to replicate the dynamics of absolute lines of flight may surface in the social space as larval subpopulations and agitating citizens. The article closely examines how the virus has opened up possible avenues for do-it-yourself activism and agitations for the reclamation of public resources, spearheaded by activist citizens on the move in defiance of stringent mobility norms. The timeframe that marks the event of the pandemic witnessed much fermentation at the level of everyday grassroots politics, provoking public unrest and extreme civil dissensions, paradoxically at a time of social paralysis, immobilization of resources, and suspension of haptic everyday transactions. These transversal mobility regimes of the beleaguered masses and peripheral subjects thus became seminal in generating spaces of civic dissent and shaping a critical public ontology at the grassroots. The molecular transformations led by fringe populations rapidly picked up momentum during the pandemic. In order to connect the disparate strands of protests, the article borrows the delusion concept of larval subjects, that is, subjects who do not consciously espouse the cause of an ideology and whose politics emerge as transversal connections born out of a sense of imperilment and imminent threat experienced in the sphere of the everyday. The article looks at the complex intersections of strands of mobilities and their effect on social metabolism. The overlapping of the viral and neoliberal vectors of molecular mobilities opens up possibilities of a dynamic crossing of thresholds that disrupt the choreographed disequilibriums of neoliberal flows of capital. The emergence of larval subjects who permeate the body of the socius at a time of social paralysis may be looked upon as a radical or insurgent mobility whose sharp lines of departure gather traction from the lines of flight traced by the virus in defiance of neoliberal technocracies. When we think of a line of flight, we always think in terms of a departure or deviation arising out of dissonance. Lines of flight are traced as major ruptures or absolute deterritorializations. As a concluding note, I wish to explore the minor lines of flight, the multiple ruptures or cracks that erupt in the homogeneous body of the social or political organism, invested in varying degrees of intensities. These lines do not indicate an absolute face-off, but productive disagreements, where multiple contradictory strands do not seek to neutralize one another, but attempt to work their way around dead ends or blockages. This is how the socius heals, through a reorientation of desire towards life and potency, rather than contention and aggressive territorializations. For example, arranging for mutual aid and organization of relief efforts at a time of a multi-pronged crisis like the pandemic, rooted in ecological, political, economic, and social imbalances, may refurbish the sense of community as a symbiotic assemblage of life, operating in spite of the jurisprudence of the neoliberal state and its parasitic dependency on host markets. As a counterpoint to this trend towards monopolization of resources in an agglomeration economy, we have the emergence of civil society organizations that look into the economic and social welfare needs of the people, thus thinking in terms of a long haul, in order to create and multiply spaces of meaningful social intervention. Thus, on the one hand, we have instances of radical activism precipitated by drastic policy shifts, and on the other, we have a slower mechanism for inclusive demographic reorganizations through creation of shelter spaces and safe spaces with access to aid. At this critical turning point, the viral intervention thus problematizes the notion of mobility and pushes it beyond the permissible thresholds of neoliberalism to initiate a processual flow. At this critical turning point, the moment of intervention remains a mobile locus within these diverse vectors of mobility that bring together the Anthropocene, the Virocene, and the Capitalocene into a productive dialogue, emphasizing their imbricated nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Swati. That was wonderful, analysis of the molecular dynamism and molar capitalist reconfigurations coming out of viral vector. And thank you. So we will move on to the next presenter of the day, Mohit Abrol.
Yeah, can you see me?
Yeah, I'll just introduce you and then you
Sure.
can begin, please. So Mohit Abrol is currently pursuing PhD in literature from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi. His research interests include postmodern condition, the rise of fascism and the Cold War era, continental philosophy, Marxist studies, political violence and the idea of justice. He's working on Bergson's influence on Eliot and is aiming to overcome the fundamental divide between Eliot the poet and Eliot the philosopher, such that Eliot can primarily be seen as a philosopher poet. Yes, Mohit,
Thank you.
please. Yeah.
Thank you. So like Zenep and Swati, I would like to begin by thanking my friend Manoj and the entire organizing team for navigating through so many different time zones to organize this 5th edition of the Lewis and Guattari conference in India. The title of my paper is Exploring the Human and the Non-Human, a Deleuzian reading of Eliot's works in the Age of Anthropocene. And here I begin. The planetary event characterized as Anthropocene in our times shares a particular relationship with the modernist milieu, which sought to represent the conflicts that extend to the non-human and the more than human world. Scattered through Eliot's poetic oeuvre is the speculation of how to think seriously about the planet. Every street lamp that Eliot's lyric persona passes from beats like a fatalistic drum with Bergsonian elan vital, the creative force, which informs both the human and the non-human realm. In this paper, I will focus on the non-human aspects in Eliot's poems, where Eliot, following Henry Bergson's concept of la durée, shifts the scales to privilege evolutionary time to conceive the vast temporality of the geological processes, something that David Cole also mentioned in his presentation. In doing so, Eliot lays bare the techniques of thought and poetic practices, which have tried to locate the spatial coordinates as they hollow out and disappear in the age of Anthropocene. Deleuze's writings carry a vitalistic element too when he states that it is organism that die, not life. Any work of art points a way through for life, finds a way through the cracks. Everything I've written is vitalistic, at least I hope it is, and amounts to a theory of signs and events. The impersonal consciousness that Deleuze talked about in his final article, Immanence a Life, is impersonal consciousness, which resembles Eliot's impersonal impulse to crystallize thoughts and emotions in their immediacy, so that poetry can provide the way to attune oneself to the speaking of language. The stake of such a project are multiple, where we are trying to understand the entanglements of human and non-human realms, not only because it reinstates the efficacy of time, which the Western philosophy, and I'm quoting Bergson here, who has argued that it has lost sight of, but also offer new ways to narrativize the Anthropocene turn. My aim in this paper is to identify the vitalistic tendencies in Eliot's poetry and Deleuze's philosophy, which can address the problems associated with the Anthropocene and look for ways to think beyond the human condition. In a singular way, Eliot occupies the place which can be best identified as in between, the place which William Carlos Williams thematized as the most perfect rock and temple, where the struggle to reconcile a linguistic conception of the cultural process with experiential data that are more and more visual unfolds. The rhythmic gesture of his poetry constitute a set of involved relations, where as a thing one can glance or glimpse the things which stand before us. Eliot's lyric registers reveal the connections between human subjectivity and the more human world, which informs the Anthropocene turn. Eliot's early poems, First Debate Between Body and Soul, 1910, Fourth Caprice in Montparnasse, 1911, He Said Universe is Very Clever, March 1911, and his most Bergsonian poem, Rhapsody on a Windy Night, 1911 once again, displays a sequence of visual illustrations, which, as from Tom Bristow in the Anthropocene lyric suggests, are attuned to perilinguistic wavelengths. The experience of Anthropocene can be felt and contemplated in these perilinguistic zones, which create an intentional field around language. The reason behind this line of argument is the fact that Anthropocene cannot be seen as a descriptive term or a singular concept, which can single-handedly invoke the theorizations offered by Timothy Morton, hyperobjects, Rosie Braduotti, nomadic thought, Timothy Clark, derangement, Dipesh Chakravarti, the climate of history for thesis, Joanna Zielinska, minimal ethics, or Spivak's planetarity. The idea is that Anthropocene has to be visualized as a coming together of all these conceptualizations as a univocal utterance. As a univocal utterance, which Derrida referred to as Mittelglide, a middle articulation, the in-between, which Geoff also mentioned in his presentation as adagra, the concept in Watsuji Tatsoro's philosophy. Anthropocene functions as a non-particular, non-detachable part. One can even say, anticipating Hegel, an ordinary part or an originary part, so to speak, the odd tail, which offers a perilinguistic zone to articulate the connections between the human and the non-human world. Anthropocene possesses us the way poetic images imposes itself upon us and serve a mobilizing force to think about the human and non-human alike. It has morphed into an ethical dimension which can only be perceived and which desists conceptualizations. Eliot's poetry seeks to orient us toward this sense of detachment, an impersonal consciousness which runs through the organic and the non-organic matter alike, which enables one to situate oneself as a thing among other things. This concern dominates his entire early poetry and appears in his frequent oscillations between philosophy and poetry as well. At this point, it should not be construed that Eliot's move towards art, which Charles Taylor states, brings us into the presence of something which otherwise remains inaccessible and which is of the highest moral or spiritual significance, is non-philosophical. Instead, Eliot's deep philosophical commitment paradoxically shines through his call for the end of metaphysics. Eliot did not want to hold an intellectual position and or adherence to a particular school of philosophy. Eliot wanted to avoid the abstractions of philosophy and the test of coherence, and wanted to test the coherence of thought in the language, which is part of the everyday experiences and is constitutive of life itself. For Deleuze and Guattari too, the connection between art and life remained vital in every sense. In What is Philosophy, Deleuze describes how art reminds us that it is one of the primary mediums with which humans learn to communicate and respond to the world. At its most elementary level, art frames the plane of composition where our bodies and even our psychic lives intermingle with the norms and social powers. We are never completely reflectively aware of our own desires and of how we were formed through traditions, interactions with others, and cultural context. For Deleuze and Guattari, it is the art that creates a domain where life can be felt, it can be touched, it can be desired, and it can be imagined. Deleuze and Guattari argued that art is much more than just a medium of expression and discursively constitutes the operations of affect and temporality, emotions and mortality. Art frames the condition for sensations to generate, metabolized and released in the world, to transform with other sensations and become something else entirely. Art at the same time projects that distance, cuts, and transforms the frame of composition, which affirms its affective capacity to move between the frames to capture the multiplicity of sensations. Deleuze's aim in the logic of sensations is to emphasize the plane of intensities that sensations imply, which create the logic to understand the reality of bodies, the pains and pleasures, the desires, and how they are being experienced as such. The Deleuzian inquiry towards the nature of art underscores the sensible rather than the intelligible, and I quote from What is Philosophy, "This is precisely the task of all art, and from colors and sounds, both music and painting similarly extract new harmonies, new plastic or melodic landscapes, and new rhythmic characters that raise them to their height of the earth's sound and cry of humanity, that which constitutes tone, health, becoming a visual and a sonorous block," unquote. The harmonious vibrations framed by art, which emerge in the form of varying intensities, posit an event where the interaction between language and bodies, corporeal and incorporeal, words and things take place. The event stands between these series as their mutual boundary. It is a third entity that has to enable and maintain the imminent transition between the two, between the sense that arises as an effect from the body's encounter and the force of language as the extra being that affects the surface. No proper laws of representation can be installed between words and things. The unstable interaction between the series of being guarantees their difference, thus creating an active boundary that makes them converge in their divergence. This is what Deleuze calls or defines as the event of disjunctive synthesis. It is in this sense, and I'm quoting Deleuze over here, it is in this sense that it is an event on the condition that the event is not to be confused with its spatio-temporal realization in a state of affairs. We will not ask, therefore, what is the sense of the event? The event is sense itself. The event belongs essentially to language. It has an essential relationship to language, but language is what is said of things, unquote. Eliot recognized this potential of language that Deleuze and Guattari were hinting at. He said, and I'm quoting Eliot now, "Only in poetry is some very small event, a dropping of a book, a turning toward the door, a silence, may give the emotion for the literary purpose and strive for a formula to expose the multitudinality of experience inherent in the immediate realization of life." Eliot's formula for poetry established a new tradition for poetic practice. Elliot's objective correlated, something which is very common to literature students. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, is a poetic gesture towards a concentrated effort of the mind to reveal an experience which can be characterized as primordial and yet concretely expressed with all its multitude. The primordiality of experience and the chimeral role it occupies in the form of appearances of a given reality is treated in Eliot as well as in Deleuze not as a form, but a power, a formidable thrust, a spark of life, a vital force which animates everything. Eliot writes in 4 quartets, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. Therefore, the real duration transcends all kinds of spatializations. This is Bergson's notion of duration, and Eliot's poetic words in striving to reveal the immediate realization of life shows Eliot's reliance on Bergsonian framework. In many ways, Deleuze is responsible, perhaps singularly, for bringing Bergson into contemporary academia from the non-existent position he had occupied since the 1922 decisive debate, actually, with Einstein about the notion of time. Bergsonian thought resurfaced only in 1960s due to Deleuze's 2 articles written in 1956, La Conception de la Différence chez Bergson and Bergson 1859-1941, and of course his monograph Bergsonism in 1966. Deleuze's attraction to Bergson's works lies in the intention with which Bergson produced the concept of élan vital, lived duration, coexisting multiplicities, and the process of becoming. Deleuze's fidelity to Bergson's oeuvre is questionable because of his own unequivocal statement about producing a monstrous child that mimes Bergson's words. This is a quote from Deleuze, but is invariably controlled by him. Nonetheless, Deleuze provided the much needed reorientation to Bergson's studies and reformulate the metaphysical and the ontological lines, making Bergson's thought more accessible and applicable to contemporary art, cinema, literature, and philosophy. Bergson's philosophy of time, which plays a pivotal role in Deleuze's entire corpus, desists from grouping under a single philosophical system because of its resistance to description based on natural and philosophical language cognates. The nature of Bergson's problems can be grasped by the interior state, which can retroactively remove the metaphors and extensiveness of space and eventually lead to a coherent unity, the university of being, the topic for Leonard Lawler's presentation, which is going to happen soon, affirms the process of becoming. In this regard, Merleau-Ponty, in Phenomenology of Perception, presented a critique of the interior state, which potentially aims to remove the spatial regions and thereby resorted to show that, and I'm quoting, the phases of movement gradually merge into one another. Nothing is anywhere in motion, unquote. Merleau-Ponty took an opposing stand from Deleuze's position, according to which the external differences exceeds to the internal differences in the purely intuitive state. Deleuze's position over here is based on the metaphor of melody that Bergson provided in his 1922 book, Duration and Simultaneity. And I quote, "A melody to which we listen with our eyes closed, heeding it alone, comes close to coinciding with this time, which is the very fluidity of our inner life. But it still has too many qualities, because that's what David Cole also tried to show in his presentation. The cone extends much deeper. Too many definitions or too much of definition, and we must first efface the difference among the sounds, then do away with the distinctive features of sound itself, retaining of it only the continuation of what precedes into what follows and the uninterrupted transition, multiplicity without divisibility, and succession without separation." Now, Merleau-Ponty argues that the loss of difference which happens in the pure duration is not grounded in the phenomenal body. And as such, the vertical passage between duration and intuition undermines Bergson's philosophical method. That was Merleau-Ponty's approach. This perspective is based on the premise that intuition apprehends duration instead of exceeding it. However, for Deleuze, consciousness is expanded via the horizontal aspect of intuition. It is the intuition which acts on discovering genuine differences and transforms the experience of knowing time. For Deleuze, the real question is not whether past exists or not, but whether past is available such that it can be acted upon. The past exists as a virtual in the present, and this difference in the nature of the past and present is grasped in the series of intuitive procedures. As a result of this recognition, the past does not pass out of existence, but remains conserved in the processual whole. The retention of the past in memories provide a way for its continuation into the present. The retention or the material traces provide the impetus to act upon the past, which is available, not existing in the ordinary sense of the word, in the present. We inhabit a world informed by Bergson and Deleuze's philosophy, where the present is always in the process of becoming, unlike the world of a mathematician, which does not endure. The material traces that define a relationship to the world are fundamentally unavoidable and yet paradoxically present themselves in order to be overcome. The material traces affirm life, its vitality, its becoming, and allows us to make sense of the world by describing its worlding, its phenomenal appearance. This is affirmed in his last essay, Immanence, a Life Too, where Deleuze refers to a life rather than life in general. In the title of the essay, the colon denotes the equivalence. Immanence as an abstract concept is rendered equivalent not even to life, but to a life. And the ellipsis which follows seems to announce the end of a life. The essay was published only weeks before Deleuze committed suicide. So, there are many parallels over there as well. At this point, before the chain goes on to the event, to becoming, to singularities, and finally to the virtual, I would like to pause for a moment and reflect on how the essay is a fragment of a projected longer text on the concept of the virtual. In the essay, this single life or spark is singular. A life that may or may not exist, that comes into being and passes away, that needs to be distinguished from all the general predicates that allow us to name and locate an individual in time. The fragmentary nature of Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, also signals a shift backward towards something primordial and instinctual. Paul Douglas suggests that beneath the fragmentary appearance of Eliot's poetry, there lies the vitality, something similar to what Deleuze also tries to talk about, the paradoxical nature of reality which shines out in every particular, and even in those which are yet to be realized. Eliot does present, to be sure of this thing, Eliot does present an apocalyptic vision in The Wasteland, and his poetic image partakes in dust, dirt, and depravity and degradation. The disconnect between the cityscape and the city dweller has arisen due to a lack of orientation, putting both the human and the non-human inhabitants at risk. In this regard, as a means of conclusion as well, in this regard, a Deleuzian reading of Eliot's works remain attuned to the profound links which exist between science, lives, events, and vitalism. Furthermore, it is by a reading of Wastelands in Making in Eliot's works that Deleuze vitalism can be shown as linked to his anti-humanism. A sign is created when thought encounters non-organic life, the outside, as sometimes Deleuze calls it. Signs are also an expression of the flux and indeterminacy of life. Deleuze enabled the thoughts to come into contact with the power of life, a life brimming with vitalism and pure immanence. As Deleuze states, and this is the last quote, "It is not immanence to life, but the immanence which is in nothing itself a life. A life is the immanence of immanence, absolute immanence. It is the sheer power, utter beauty too," unquote. This fluid structure of the vitalistic spirit, which informs life, which categorizes life, which conceptualizes life, is also that of a rhizome and multiplicity. That's why Deleuze's vitalism is expressed in the preference for verbs, particularly in the infinitive form over nouns. And I quote, "Infinitive expresses becomings or events that transcend mood and tense," unquote. The way Deleuze viewed life, the question about Anthropocene becomes both much more direct and more subtle. How to reorient ourselves to the positive forces of life, towards the pre-individual nature of life. Paradoxically, it is in the Eliot's poetic world where the fragments have been shown against the ruins, and where the world ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, that an exploration between the human and the non-human and their vitalistic connections must be carried out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mohit. That was again wonderful presentation exploring the human and non-human. And yes, it was a paper which forwarded what Geoff was speaking about in the morning. And of course, David Cole, I could recall that graph, the diagram which he showed when you talked and you reproduced what T.S. Eliot had, quoted him on time.
Yes.
So, well, thank you. And we'll move on to the next speaker, right? And I'll request the audience and the participants to please put your questions in the chat box so that after Arnab's presentation, we can have a good discussion. So our fourth presenter of the day is Arnab Chakarbati. He's an independent scholar, researcher, self-employed teacher, and professional. He has completed 2 years of PhD coursework in English at Ashoka University and is researching on the history of spiritualism and its techno-religious allegories, 19th century science, and on Western esotericism and occultism. He completed his master's and BA honors in English from Jadavpur University in Kolkata. He has written more than 30 academic papers, which are forthcoming in late 2021-22 from peer-reviewed international journals, and is also a member of numerous scholarly associations related to his research interests. In 2021, he presented a number of national and international virtual and hybrid conferences. His wide range of research preferences include German idealism, Western historicism, European decadence, deluge and new materialisms, Frankfurt School, supernatural and folklore in the Indian subcontinent. Very impressive, Arnab, please. And he's going to speak on occult worlds, speculative realities, and the esoteric heritage of post-humanism. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. My presentation will be from it's a PowerPoint presentation, and it's a presentation of the proposal for a monograph. Now it's a work in progress. Now I would like to share my screen, and just a minute. Just share the screen. Okay. So this is the work in progress, and it's a proposal for a projected monograph. Now it attempts to a comparative reading of the ontologies of life, and I'll just expand it a moment. It attempts to a comparative reading of the ontologies of life and those of immaterial worlds, transformative experiences, and values that construct the post-human becomings of such lives. Now, this monograph is mostly about the Buddhist tantric texts of Kalachakra and Vajrayana in the natural philosophy of the counter-enlightenment philosopher F.W.J. Schelling, in the short stories regarding the occult experiences of a certain Tarana tantric of 20th century Bengali novelist Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay and his son, the writer Taradas Bandyopadhyay, and in the major novels of Prague-based Austrian philosophical writer and novelist Gustav Meyrink, through the meteorological lens of Deleuze's philosophy of flows and processes, Ian Whitehead's process philosophy and cosmology, the deep vitalist subschool of the contemporary reception of Schelling within speculative realism or new materialisms, the politics of animism in Jane Bennett and Graham Harvey, and the panpsychism of Philip Goff, who is an analytical philosopher. Now, in this section, in the presentation, it will only be a sharing of the introduction, and hope I can mediate an understanding of what I'm after, the ideas I'm after. The monograph is not complete, like some insights from the closed readings are incorporated into this proposal, but they'll be further developed. Now the introduction. The intervention the paper attempts to make is in the discourses of life in its complexities and contested in their associations with moral and ethical values, with the aesthetics and politics of transformation and becoming more than human, post-human or meta-human, and within animism and panpsychist cosmologies. Now the thesis statement, the major thesis statement of the monograph is the intervention that argues in favor of an occult post-human heritage with epistemological origins in counter-enlightenment thought of the German idealists, although its esoteric and hermetic roots go back to the first, whom Hegel called the first German philosopher, Jacob Boehm, and further back into early antiquity and Eastern Indian and Buddhist metaphysics. So this occult post-human heritage will include the ritual initiatory procedures of the Kalchakra and Vajrayana schools of Indian and Tibetan Tantrism of transforming into an ideal self, the philosophy of nature and indeterminacy of F.W.J. Schelling, and the novels and stories of Mering and the Bandopadhyayas. The above, all of this shall be closely read through the methodological and theoretical lens of Deleuze and Whitehead's process philosophy, those of contemporary new animist and panpsychist worldviews of the philosopher and political theorist Jane Bennett, and the analytical philosopher Philip Goff, and those of the deep vitalists, mainly Ian Hamilton Grant, and the contemporary receptionists of Schelling like Tyler Triton, Ben Woodward, and of what is loosely the new materialist school. The thesis will argue for a continuous flux and process of matter, life, and phenomena that is largely indeterminate and ateleological. The thesis argues that any search for or projection of a telos within the occult philosophical scientific scheme of things establishes grand narratives that appropriate, which inevitably leads towards the determinate presence of truth, that a sort of closure of the delusion or stabilization of the Deleuzian process and closure of the Derridian play. So, as the thesis argues, for a physics and metaphysics of process and indeterminacy, it also proposes that truths are to be found in the plenitude and wonder of life forms that populate all possible and impossible realities and worlds. Now, the ethical stakes of such a proposition lie in our contemporary proliferation, invention, and discovery of myriad forms of life, pervading the cosmos from the virtual to the realities of deep space. The thesis pushes the stakes further by proposing that the sense of wonder which we as sentient and organic biomes feel affectively at this plenitude of life is analogous to the presence of a more authentic truth that allows and imagines more life in process and play than the hegemony of a determinate telos. Now, I shall also be relating the affect that one feels, or the bhav or bhava of rasa theory in Indian the philosopher Abhinava Gupta, and also Bharata. Bharata, who propounded the rasa theory in his Natya Shastra, and also later Abhinava Gupta, I intend to analyze affect that stems from this sense of wonder, and this is contrasted against the teleological models of Judeo-Christianity, and also secular grand narratives like the Marxist scheme of history, and how the stakes of this thesis propounds this ethics of wonder, that this plenitude of life which inevitably summons the ethical necessity to value its sanctity. Arguing for such a stakes has profound implication in our contemporary neoliberal and technocratic ethos in the late Anthropocene, where life is devalued as expendable at the altar of profit and progress. Now, apart from the text under analysis, what this thesis also has stakes in is a necessity, urgency, and immediacy to value and preserve life in its plenitude during the sixth extinction event, which is also the first to be brought about by a species in late capitalist modernity and the Anthropocene. So this is my short presentation, and I'm working on the ideas, and it will and hope to develop this into a monograph. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Arnab, for that. Was just sharing your proposal. So now the papers are open for discussion. So we had Zeynep talking about cybersex, Swati talking about 3 aspects of a paper: viral vector, neoliberalism, and larval populations, bringing in capitalism, and Mohit, of course, exploring the human and non-human, delusion reading of Eliot's works in the age of Anthropocene, and Arnab's proposal, which he intends to take up for his PhD thesis. So you can type your questions in the chat box, or you can straight away ask the presenters. So I was just wondering, till we are having questions from the participants, Zeynep, I was just wondering the paradox that is involved in cybersex entering into the physical space, right? Where desires are created in the cybersex towards assemblage, right? And this shift in the domain of cybersex, it becomes, I mean, it's a paradoxical, it's entering into physical space, and it is it is also rendering it genderless, non-hierarchical. So would you like to just comment on it?
I'm mostly interested in the part that you're saying, because like I said in my presentation, the minute we enter into cybersex with these toys, the minute we connect ourselves to machines, it's not even human sex anymore. It's basically sex with machines. So if these machines don't have a gender, how can we define ourselves heterosexual or homosexual? And if you imagine that cybersex will be more popular in the future, some people will choose to have sex with machines than with human beings. And maybe we have to invent new sexualities for them, like technosexual or, I don't know, cybersexual. And this is really opening a new, how can I say it? It's totally changing the plane of existence of sexuality because it's inorganic. And it's also an opportunity to break from this cycle of reproduction that we are forced to get into, you know. Of course, in the modern world, we don't have sex to recreate, but that's the end game still. That's the main goal the society wants us to achieve at the end. So when you have sex with machines, you can be reproductive, and this is a break from the from capitalist society's cycle, and that's also what interests me a lot in cybersex.
Yeah, so I mean, giving new definitions from existence to social structure and henceforth, right?
Yes.
All right. So, anybody else who has some sort of, Thoughts on that? And Swati, I was quite intrigued by your usage. Swati, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was just intrigued because if lines of flight, we always take them to be lines of rupture. So when you were using the larval populations or the calibrated flux within the partial, so that actually amazed me, the partial lines of flight. Can you just, dwell on that for a while?
Actually, the last section of the essay, I kind of added it on only yesterday. And I was thinking, what if we do not create these very well-defined interfaces, maybe where activism leads into, where you're confronting the opponent with a well-defined set of agendas. And that would be a kind of line of flight, but then these partial lines of flight, which we sort of overlook by focusing on the molar oppositions. That I found that idea very interesting because I was reading through something which was speaking about the aid organizations or the informal aid networks that were organized during the pandemic. And I thought that would be those subtle lines of departure where you do not confront the polity face to face, but you make your own intervention in your own way. So that was the whole concept of coming up with the subtle
molecular dynamism, and then that brings in molar capitalist reconfigurations and configurations and so on. Yeah. Okay. So anybody else? Yeah. I don't think so.
Yeah, I have a
Mohit, yes,
intervention. So adding to the point that Zainab just made about, what exactly is the future where we see, there is a very strong possibility of sexual intercourse happening with the machines. I think Joff is also here in this session. And in one of the previous presentations, he had mentioned this weird Japanese concept where very young children would not leave their house and they would remain completely fixated with video games for 6 to 7 months. And Japanese government had to make a law to stop this kind of a fascination because they would just not interact with their own parents as well. So, I'm just assuming that in Japan, the kind of future prospect that Zainab talked about in her presentation has kind of already become a reality, where there are people who are getting married to robots in a church because they cannot find that kind of a fruition, that kind of a fruitful encounter with the fellow human beings. Already the ratio between men and women is so lopsided in some of these Eastern countries like South Korea and Japan, including China, that I think this is what is going to become a reality very soon in other parts of the world as well.
And that's another planetary concern.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. So, Mohit, I've already talked about your paper because it was very intense in the sense, and it could echo the Indian philosophy in many, aspects, because when you talked about coherence of thought in language, so that was a sort of echo of what Sundar Sarukar was also talking about when he drew parallels between philosophy and art, where both are thinking prone, but the degree of thinking is different, right?
Right.
And then the words and things, and of course bringing in disjunctive conjunction. So I think that is the third part of the series he talks about, third or fourth, I don't remember. And of course the time, and bringing in Bergson and reinstating the relevance, or you can say the visibility of Bergson through delusion approach. So it was quite interesting. So I think, yeah. So we'll just wait for a while, or you can just, discuss among yourself with the paper readers till we have somebody from audience, or then we can conclude because we have a plenary session 6th, which is at 3:30. So if there aren't any questions or any discussion, then we can, take a break of 15 minutes and come again in the same room. We have the same Zoom meeting for the next plenary. in which we have a paper from Rick Dolphin and Daniela, and chaired by Amin. So Manoj, anything else? Any announcement you want to make, or should we just conclude it here? Manoj probably is not here. Hi, Eva. Hi.
I was just wondering whether I should say something or not, but I decided to do it.
Please do. Yeah.
I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to listen to all these very inspiring presentations. Zeynep, Swati, Mohit, Arnab, I'm so happy to meet you, and I would like to perhaps ask a short question or two. Actually, I'm going to start with Zeynep because we have already met at the Delhi conference, and also we are in touch now. We're trying to proceed along the lines which were started there at the previous conference. And I was really wondering, Zeynep, speaking about cyber sex as a new possibility of life and also of human relations, where do you think, I hope this is not a complex question, but it's really made me think and wondering, where will this bring us in our own definition and our own, should I say, a comprehension of humanities? And would that mean that, going beyond the binaries, would that also mean that we should get rid of, femininities, masculinities, and so on and so on? It's really a very complex idea. And of course, the main topic of separating sexuality as something which is really important for the humanity of the human beings, and it's extremely important for the present day, for the era we live in, I'm sure. From reproduction, this is one thing. But where do you think this, cyber sex liberation, if I may understand it well, is going to bring us? And would that have any impact on new forms, or also abolishing forms of madness? I'm thinking about, the whole tradition of feminism and psychoanalysis relating sexuality to neurosis and so on and so on. So what do you think, where that might bring us? And yes, Zeynep, hello again.
Hi, Eva. It's a lot of questions, so I have to try to answer them as much as I can. I think there will be several stages of cybersex. Cybersex now is more or less a perversity. You're right, it's a marginal way of having sex. But I think it will be more popular in the real future. And then we have to think about, like I said, we have to find a new category for people who engage in cybersex, like homosexual, heterosexual, and maybe cybersexual. And I don't think that on the short run, it will completely destroy the gender binary and then we will all be genderless. But we have to create another category for cyborgs too. When you think about, like Mohit said, if you marry to a robot or a cyborg, then these robots and cyborgs also have a gender or also have a category. And Donna Haraway actually explains it really good in a Cyborg Manifesto, that they will be, of course, another minority. And maybe what we have to think about and what we have to avoid is to create another minority to implement the capitalistic society. But how can we use this new technology, and how can we use cyborgs and cybersex to create a more balanced world, a less hierarchical world? That's what I'm always aiming to achieve, actually.
Thank you.
Eva, you like to, yeah, please.
Sorry, I was just wondering whether I might also add a short question for Swati.
Yes, please.
Talking about the biomedical, the biopolitical, the biosocial. I was wondering whether this would be all somehow related on the same level, or whether might not be the biopolitical somehow not in the center, not on the top of the list, but anyway, very exciting from this point of view, how to relate it, the biopolitical to the biomedical and the biosocial. Actually, I was thinking about Michel Foucault and his idea that whenever we confront the problems of medical order, and in this context, the critique, Foucault's critique of the medical order, we always come also to the legal system and what is related, the medical and the legal. And Foucault got it, as far as I know, from Canguilhem, and both of them insist so much that we should actually, whenever we think about the biomedical, we have to think about the legal system and everything that is related to it. And I wonder how come, how would, somewhere in between the biomedical, the biopolitical, and the biosocial, how could you, in a way, also think of this very important legal system point of view, which is extremely determining our lives nowadays, and not just from the birth of the prison on, but perhaps even more so. Did you also think about, putting between the biomedical, the biopolitical, the biosocial, this very important dimension of the biolegal, or would it be more in? Would you put it more in the biopolitical aspect of the problem or in the biomedical? Just a short comment. I hope it's not too a broader question.
I think what I tried to do was kind of speak about the the dilution of boundaries between the biomedical, the biopolitical, and the biosocial, and these spheres coming into closer proximity with the outbreak of the virus. And as far as the legal element is concerned, I guess I spoke about it briefly in the last section where I speak about the neoliberal jurisprudence system and how we can go beyond that system and make interventions. So I guess I'll keep your suggestion in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva, for those observations. And thank you for the wonderful session, all the speakers. Thank you so much. So we'll start the next plenary at 7 minutes from now. Isn't Manoj is there? Manoj, right?
We will start by 3:30.
3:30.
Yeah. We'll have a small switchover time, but the link will remain.